The Moral Professor's Dilemma. Picture this. It's 1759 at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. Professor Adam Smith, who teaches ethics, is deep in thought in his study. This 36-year-old moral philosopher has just published his first major work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and it's causing an enormous stir throughout Britain. But Smith himself is troubled by a nagging question that his own book has raised. In his ethics lectures, Smith taught that humans are naturally compassionate beings. He defined this core value as sympathy, the uniquely human ability to empathize with others' joy and pain. Sympathy is also our innate moral sense that leads us toward virtue and away from vice. Smith wrote in The Theory of Moral Sentiments that this moral sympathy creates the bonds that hold society together. But after publishing his book, as Smith walks through Glasgow's bustling market streets, he opens his eyes to a new reality that seems to contradict his moral philosophy. The city is thriving, commerce is booming, and people are generally well-fed and prosperous. Yet the craftsmen and merchants, he observes, are clearly not motivated by sympathy or virtue. What motivates them is their own personal interest, self-interest. The baker on High Street doesn't bake bread because he feels sympathy for hungry people. The blacksmith across the street doesn't shoe horses out of moral duty. The wool merchant doesn't trade with London because he wants to spread virtue across Britain. They all do what they do because they want to make money, support their families, and improve their circumstances. But here's what puzzles Smith. Their selfish behavior somehow creates results that benefit everyone. The self-interested baker feeds the town. The profit-seeking blacksmith keeps transportation running smoothly. The greedy merchant connects distant markets and spreads prosperity. Self-interest connects to public interest. How can this be possible? How can a society of moral beings prosper through seemingly immoral behavior? This paradox haunted Smith for 17 years, until he finally resolved it in his masterwork, The Wealth of Nations. The butcher, the brewer, and the baker. Smith's insight about self-interest and public interest wasn't entirely original. Decades earlier, Bernard Mandeville, a Dutch-English doctor and satirist, had caused a great stir in London society with The Fable of the Bees. Published in 1714, this book begins with the story of a beehive where all the bees are consumed with vice, yet everyone prospers. The vices that lead the hive to prosperity are pride, envy, greed, and selfishness. The bees, consumed with vice, constantly complained about their wicked society. Then one day, Jupiter, king of the gods, decided to answer their prayers. Overnight, he made all the bees virtuous. The bees became honest, humble, and altruistic. Then something amazing happened. The hive immediately became impoverished. The vices that had made them prosperous, luxury goods, competition, innovation driven by pride and greed, all disappeared. Mandeville's work shocked British society. The book's subtitle was the explicit phrase, "Private Vices, Public Benefits." He argued that precisely those qualities that religious leaders condemned, selfishness, pride, desire for luxury, were what made society wealthy. London's moral establishment was outraged. How dare he claim that vice benefits society? The book was condemned by churches and banned by grand juries. But Mandeville deserves credit for identifying the profound connection between individual motivation and social outcomes. 60 years later, when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, he was deeply influenced by Mandeville's insight, but he refined it brilliantly. Smith didn't celebrate vice. Instead, he showed how self-interest guided by market forces could produce beneficial results for society, public good. Smith said, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. The butcher doesn't cut meat because he loves us. The brewer doesn't make beer out of kindness, and the baker doesn't bake bread from charity. They do it to make money. Yet through this pursuit of self-interest, they feed the entire community better than any central planner could. The invisible hand." Smith called this mysterious mechanism the invisible hand. This is perhaps the most beautiful metaphor in the history of economics. Just as an invisible hand seemed to guide individual self-interest toward the public good, market forces would coordinate the actions of millions of people, each pursuing their own goals, into a prosperous society. So for society to function well, people don't need to be angels. People can be selfish, greedy, and competitive. Through the magic of the invisible hand, their selfishness will be guided toward the public good. Smith's insight was revolutionary because it challenged both the medieval notion that economic life should be guided by moral and religious principles, and the mercantilist belief that wealth accumulation was only possible by restraining individual self-interest. Smith firmly believed that trading and exchanging are human nature, and that freely pursuing self-interest according to this human nature would lead to the public good. Thus, the capitalist system based on the pursuit of self-interest received its absolution. When the invisible hand gets arthritis. Fast forward to 2025, and we see phenomena everywhere suggesting that Smith's invisible hand has developed serious problems. Consider the smartphone in your pocket. Smith would have marveled at this device. It represents a triumph of global specialization and market coordination. The rare earth metals needed to make smartphones are mined in Africa. Chips are manufactured in Taiwan, assembly takes place in China, and software is created in California. Everything is coordinated not by government but by market forces and profit incentives. But what would confound Smith are other aspects of the smartphone economy. The market structure dominated by a few giant tech companies like Apple, Google, and Amazon. They use their monopoly power to charge high prices, stifle innovation, and pick the pockets of both workers and consumers. The invisible hand that was supposed to guide self-interest toward public good has malfunctioned. Facebook's case betrays Adam Smith in a different dimension. Zuckerberg pursued his self-interest by building a successful company, and Facebook was guided toward the public good of connecting people and making the world more open. But it's also true that the invisible hand is leading Facebook down a darker path. The company discovered that anger and outrage keep users engaged longer than happiness and truth. The algorithm began promoting divisive and extreme content more frequently because it's more profitable. Zuckerberg's self-interest in maximizing user engagement and advertising revenue began working against the public interest of truth, democracy, and social cohesion. We could say this is a case where the pursuit of self-interest leads to vice. The climate catastrophe. Nowhere is the failure of the invisible hand more apparent than in climate change. In the mid-1970s, ExxonMobil already knew through its own scientists the scientific fact that carbon dioxide emissions cause global warming. However, Exxon concealed this, and by the late 1980s was even funding think tanks that promoted climate change skepticism. Their self-interest directly contradicted the public interest. The invisible hand guided them not toward the public good, but toward potentially catastrophic consequences for humanity.
What Smith got right and wrong. So was Adam Smith wrong about the invisible hand?
Not entirely. The invisible hand still works in most markets. However, with changing times, areas have emerged where the invisible hand doesn't function. For instance, Smith's era was a world of small producers and local markets. He couldn't have imagined the giant corporations, global supply chains, and network effects that characterize today's economy. When Facebook or Google misbehaves, there are virtually no viable alternatives. Smith was also a scholar of the Enlightenment, when people believed human reason could solve any problem. Because he had faith in the rationality of both individuals and systems, he assumed market forces would naturally lead to optimal outcomes. Today we live in a world rife with cognitive biases, systemic risks, and unintended consequences. Sometimes the invisible hand leads us into traffic jams. Sometimes markets need visible rules. The lesson isn't that markets don't work. Markets remain the best mechanism we've discovered for coordinating complex economic activity. But modern markets need visible rules to ensure the invisible hand points in the right direction. Sometimes this means antitrust regulation to break up monopolies and restore competition, or regulations to prevent companies from externalizing their costs to society as polluters do. And it means providing public goods like basic research, infrastructure, and education that markets ignore but benefit society as a whole. Even Smith acknowledged this. Contrary to popular understanding, in The Wealth of Nations, he emphasized the role of government, national defense, maintaining law and order, and public works that private companies consider unprofitable but benefit society as a whole. It's unfair to characterize Smith as a free market fundamentalist. Smith's invisible hand is a very important achievement in the history of capitalist economics. Recognizing that millions of people can coordinate their activities without central planning, and that individual pursuit of self-interest can align with the public interest, was sufficient to justify all subsequent actions in capitalist market economies. But ironically, today's economic phenomena may be closer to Mandeville, who said vice leads to prosperity, than to Smith, who believed self-interest would be guided toward the public good. Giant tech companies do indeed embody Mandeville's world more than Smith's. Their success often comes from exploiting human weaknesses like social media addiction, impulse buying, and voyeurism. They've created prosperity through what Mandeville would call digital vices. Conclusion: searching for a new hand. Now for the conclusion of this long story. What we need today isn't to abandon Smith's invisible hand, but to give it physical therapy. Examples include carbon taxes on polluters. It might mean treating tech platforms as regulated public utilities, or providing universal basic income in an economy where traditional jobs are disappearing. The goal isn't to replace markets with central planning. That attempt has already failed historically. Instead, it's to create market structures where Smith's invisible hand can once again be guided toward the public good in this changed world. Smith would agree with this. He believed markets were tools for human flourishing, not ends in themselves. If the invisible hand isn't serving humanity, we need to adjust the conditions under which it operates. Smith wrote, "The real price of everything, what everything really costs to the man who wants to acquire it, is the toil and trouble of acquiring it." This statement that labor determines the value of goods has largely faded in modern times. Today, the real cost of some things, monopoly power, environmental destruction, social division, is higher than what the invisible hand calculates. Making those costs visible might be the key to making the invisible hand work properly again.